Welcome, dear listener. As you ease into the gentle rhythm of this story, take a deep breath, get comfortable, and allow yourself to drift into a quieter time. You're here, and I'm truly grateful. Before we begin, I invite you to pause and share in the comments where you are in the world and what time it is. It's always a marvel to see how far this quiet little corner of history travels across oceans, cities, fields, and sleepy suburbs. We live in a fast world, filled with noise and movement. But here, you've chosen stillness, curiosity, and the comfort of old stories, told softly. If this journey into the calm corridors of the past brings you a sense of peace, I gently encourage you to subscribe to the channel, like this video, and let us know what part of history helps you unwind the most. Your presence here is deeply appreciated. Now, let us set the stage. The medieval world. Picture it not as the fantasy of sword fights and dragons, but as it truly was for most: quiet, difficult, and bound by rhythms older than memory. Imagine a home made of timber and thatch, nestled in a village of dirt roads and small fires. Inside, the air is heavy with the scent of wood smoke and boiled barley. A simple table sits in the middle, uneven legs resting on packed earth. On it, a bowl of thin porridge, a dark, coarse chunk of bread, and maybe, if fortune has smiled, a scrap of salted meat. This was dinner, not for one unlucky soul, but for millions, over centuries. It was sustenance, not satisfaction, a way to push back the gnawing edge of hunger just a little longer. The wealthy dined on roasted meats and wine-soaked fruits, but the average peasant ate what they could grow, trade, or forage. Their meals were as repetitive as they were sparse, and the concept of culinary pleasure was, for them, a dream far removed. Tonight, we begin a journey into why food in medieval times was so lacking, why it so often sucked. To put it plainly, we'll peel back the layers not to mock the past, but to understand it, because in the struggle to put something, anything on the table each day, we find a portrait of resilience, community, and survival. So lean in, breathe deeply, and let your imagination wander. We're going back to a time when every bite was earned through sweat, soil, and sacrifice. This is not just the history of food. It's the story of hunger, hope, and the everyday magic of making do. In this first section, we'll stay in this gentle moment of introduction. We'll ease into the mood and setting and give ourselves the space to feel what life might have been like when the world was dimmer and slower, when dinner was not guaranteed, and when the meaning of a meal stretched far beyond flavor. Let's start with the setting. Picture a medieval village in the early morning. The mist clings to the fields like a whisper. There's no traffic hum, no electric glow, only the bleat of sheep, the lowing of cattle, and the distant ring of a blacksmith's hammer. In the small homes, people rise with the sun. They wake to the cold, to the damp, to the need. There's work to be done before food can be thought of. Firewood must be fetched, water drawn. The hearth must be lit if it hasn't gone out overnight. The pot from the night before might still have a crust of gruel at the bottom, now congealed and gray. This will be breakfast, warmed, if there's fuel to spare. Meals are not events, they are necessities. The day's first nourishment might come hours after waking, after animals have been tended, after children dressed and fields checked. Food is fuel for labor, not leisure, and the labor is unending. The village oven is used by many, Not every home has its own, and so baking bread is a shared act, a communal rhythm. Families take turns, and the loaves are marked to identify whose is whose. Bread is the backbone of survival. Black bread, rough and dense, full of bran and grit. It fills the stomach, though it might wear down the teeth. There is no store to run to, no pantry to raid. Everything that enters a peasant's mouth has passed through their own hands, or the hands of someone nearby. Barter is more common than coin. Eggs for onions, wool for flour. There's a dignity in the exchange, but also a desperation. The line between abundance and hunger is thread thin. And then there's the church, the great overseer of the soul, and by extension, the stomach. Fasting days, saints' days, holy days, all dictate what can and cannot be eaten. Even the meager meals of the poor must bow to the calendar of faith. Lent, Advent, and countless Fridays mean no meat, no dairy, no eggs. Just when a family might be able to enjoy a bit of sausage or a wedge of cheese, they must instead set it aside, waiting for permission to enjoy what little they have. But it's not all bleakness. In the flicker of the hearth, there is laughter. In the shared loaf, there is care. In the rituals of making and breaking bread, there is culture, connection, and meaning. And that's part of what makes this exploration so profound. For even as the meals themselves were often dull and unsatisfying, the act of feeding and being fed was deeply human. As we journey through this exploration of medieval food, we won't only look at what was missing, we'll also uncover the quiet brilliance in how people made the most of what they had, how fermentation, pickling, drying, and ingenuity brought flavor where none was expected, how communities rallied around scarcity, how faith gave structure to struggle. Tonight is just the beginning. In the next section, we'll meet the spice merchants, those daring souls who crossed continents to bring flavor to Europe's tables. We'll trace the shimmering thread of cinnamon, the fire of pepper, and the gold dust of saffron, and we'll see why, for the average peasant, these tastes remained out of reach. But for now, breathe again, feel the earth underfoot, hear the crackle of a fire, and know that every bite we take today was built on centuries of perseverance. This is history for the heart. This is nourishment for the curious soul. In a world dimly lit by candlelight and warmed by flickering hearths, flavor was not a given. It was a marvel. Tonight, let's follow the footsteps of spice merchants and the thread of luxury that passed far above the heads of most medieval peasants. This is the story of cinnamon, nutmeg, cloves, and pepper, tiny fragments of distant lands that, for centuries, shaped entire economies and empires. Imagine, if you will, a single clove, brown, dry, no bigger than a fingernail. And yet, in the 13th century, it was worth its weight in gold. In the bustling spice markets of Venice and Genoa, spices were not measured in teaspoons, but in coins, power, and prestige. A pound of nutmeg could purchase a cow. A handful of black peppercorns might pay your taxes. These exotic spices didn't grow anywhere near Europe. They came from the distant islands of Indonesia, from the coasts of India, from the hot, humid forests of Sri Lanka and the Arabian Peninsula. To get them, merchants would brave deserts and seas, political dangers and pirates. The journey from the Maluku Islands, once called the Spice Islands, to London or Paris was long, treacherous, and often deadly, and yet they came. Let's travel back to the Silk Road. Not just one road, but a vast web of trade routes stretching from China to the Mediterranean. Along these dusty paths, spices were passed from hand to hand like secrets. An Arab trader might receive cinnamon from a Tamil sailor, then carry it north across desert caravans to a Venetian broker, who in turn sold it to a French noble. Each link in the chain raised the price. But why were spices so precious? The first reason: preservation. In a world without refrigeration, spices could mask the scent of aging meat, flavor stale bread, and give a sense of freshness to food that was anything but fresh. Second, medicine. Pepper was believed to balance bodily humors. Clove was used for toothaches, and cinnamon was a cure-all. These weren't just flavorings. They were seen as essential tools for survival. And third, status. To serve a dish seasoned with saffron or nutmeg was a statement of power. It meant you had wealth. It meant you had connections. For most peasants, these flavors were like stars, visible, perhaps, in the distance, but utterly unreachable. Their spice rack, if it existed, held only what grew nearby: mustard seeds, wild garlic, horseradish, and vinegar. These strong, pungent ingredients were used less for pleasure and more for necessity. Vinegar extended the life of food. Garlic masked the smell of old meat. Mustard covered bitterness. The food wasn't designed to delight. It was designed to endure. But let us not rush past the merchants themselves. Imagine a Genoese spice trader of the 14th century. His ship is small, wooden, and filled with barrels, wrapped in oilskin and ropes. The hold smells rich and strange, of cardamom, dried ginger, black pepper, and myrrh. He wears wool and carries a dagger. He's not only a businessman, but a risk-taker, a diplomat, a sometimes smuggler. He might sail through the Strait of Gibraltar, hugging the coasts of Africa, dodging pirates, or perhaps he joins a caravan across Egypt to the Red Sea, then boards a dhow to India. Every mile is a negotiation. Bribes, tolls, bandits. Every return home is a miracle. The spice trade shaped medieval geopolitics. Wars were fought, alliances formed, and empires built on the flow of these small, fragrant goods. The Crusades were not just about holy lands. They opened up Eastern markets. Venice grew rich as a gateway for Eastern goods. Later, Spain and Portugal would send ships around Africa and across the Atlantic in search of faster, cheaper spice routes. But at the kitchen tables of common folk, these global dramas meant little. What mattered was that a rare pinch of pepper might appear once a year, that a lord's wedding feast might include a dish with saffron, that once, just once, a wandering merchant shared a bit of ginger in a village square. These were events, almost sacred in their rarity. And here's a detail to warm the imagination. In some rural European villages, peppercorns were kept not in the kitchen, but in a locked chest like jewelry. They were counted. They were gifts passed down. Imagine handing your daughter, on her wedding day, not only a dowry of linens and goats, but 3 precious peppercorns. The idea of taste, of flavor, was deeply entwined with identity and aspiration. Monks wrote treatises on the virtue of modest meals. But even monasteries craved the sensory spark of spice. In one abbey ledger, a monk records the theft of a single ounce of saffron as a matter of great scandal, not for its culinary loss, but for its value. We must also consider the myths. Medieval Europeans didn't know where cinnamon came from. Some believed it was fished from the Nile. Others thought giant birds collected it from cliff sides, and traders had to trick them into dropping it. These legends made spices more magical and more expensive. But let us not leave this section thinking only of the powerful and wealthy. For every spice lord in Venice, there were hundreds of nameless sailors, porters, and guides who died anonymous deaths on the journey. Spices were bathed in blood, in sweat, in hope. They were commodities and dreams. And so, we return to our quiet medieval village. In the peasant's stew, there is no pepper. In the bread, no cinnamon. But perhaps, just once, a pot of festival soup holds a single bay leaf, a clove from a generous traveler. And for a moment, the meal is not just food. It is story. It is luxury. It is magic. In our next chapter, we'll explore what the average person could actually grow and eat in the changing seasons. We'll talk about turnips and leeks, barley and beans, the foundation of the real medieval diet. But for now, dream of caravans winding through the desert, of tiny spices worth a fortune, and of a world where a taste could mean the difference between common and king. As we leave behind the spice-laden caravans and distant trading ports, we return to the quieter rhythms of the medieval countryside, where the true backbone of daily life was not luxury, but labor. This is where we meet the humble heroes of the medieval diet: barley, beans, onions, leeks, and turnips. They didn't come in barrels, stamped with the mark of far-off merchants. They came from the earth, coaxed into being by hands weathered from toil. Imagine stepping into a field at dawn. The dew still clings to the grass. A figure bends over rows of plants, a woven basket at their side. This is a peasant, man or woman, beginning the daily work of sustenance. Every seed planted is a gamble against weather, pests, and time. The tools are few: a wooden spade, a sickle, perhaps an ox-drawn plow shared among neighbors. But the knowledge is deep, passed down through generations, tailored to the stubborn soil. Most peasants lived on what they could grow, with little room for indulgence. Their diets were overwhelmingly vegetarian, not by choice, but by necessity. The fields determined the menu. Grains were primary, especially barley and rye. Wheat, though preferred for its lighter bread, was often too costly for the poor. Instead, dark, coarse loaves, filled with bran and sometimes mixed with legumes, were the norm. And then there was porridge, ubiquitous and unrelenting, a thick, gluey mass made from boiled grains, often flavored only with a pinch of salt or a bit of onion. It was eaten morning, noon, and night, sometimes left to cool and solidify. It was sliced and fried the next day, a culinary recycling of the past. Legumes provided the next line of defense against hunger. Peas, beans, and lentils were not only easy to grow, but rich in protein. They were the meat of the poor, stewed slowly with herbs and root vegetables. They offered warmth and a semblance of satisfaction. In the coldest months, a well-stored sack of dried peas could mean the difference between hunger and survival. Onions and leeks were cherished for their hardiness and flavor. They grew in difficult soil, lasted through seasons, and added life to otherwise bland dishes. They were boiled, roasted, fried in animal fat if available, or pickled for preservation. Even medieval cookbooks, written for the rich, included simple, leek-based recipes, perhaps a nod to their universal appeal. Root vegetables, turnips, radishes, carrots were the unsung workhorses. Grown underground, they stored well and were less vulnerable to pests. The turnip in particular was a staple, eaten raw, boiled, mashed, or even grated into bread. It was as common in the medieval world as the potato would later become. Fruits and leafy greens added occasional variety. Apples, pears, plums, and berries were foraged or grown in small orchards. Most were eaten fresh in season or dried for use during winter. Cabbage was another staple, hardy and adaptable. It was boiled into soups, fermented into sauerkraut, or layered into stews. But the medieval kitchen was not kind to freshness. Without refrigeration, food began spoiling almost as soon as it was harvested. Meals had to be planned around availability and durability. That meant most produce was cooked, sometimes to the point of obliteration. Nutrients were lost, but bellies were filled. Herbs added the illusion of flavor when spices were unattainable. Thyme, sage, parsley, and dill grew in kitchen gardens and along village paths. They were used medicinally as well, steeped into teas, poultices, or tinctures. A handful of parsley might fight infection. A sprig of thyme might soothe a cough. These were not just garnishes, they were lifelines. There was rhythm to it all. The planting and harvesting seasons shaped every part of life. Spring brought leafy greens, early onions, and fresh herbs. Summer added beans and berries. Autumn meant root vegetables and grain harvests. Winter was the season of scarcity, when the cellar and the smokehouse had to suffice. The cellar, often just a cool hole, dug beneath a house, stored apples, onions, and root vegetables. The smokehouse preserved meat, if there was any. But for most peasants, it was the dried peas, the pickled cabbage, the sour bread that kept them alive until the thaw. The ingenuity of peasant cooking deserves respect. With little, they created systems that sustained generations. Techniques like drying, fermenting, and cellaring were passed down, not as recipes, but as survival strategies. And there were celebrations too. On feast days, or after a successful harvest, meals took on a rare richness. Honey might sweeten a dish. Milk might be spared for a custard. A handful of nuts or a piece of cheese might grace the table. These were not ordinary meals. They were remembered. Even in scarcity, there was creativity. Peasants made flatbreads on hot stones. They brewed thin ales from leftover grain. They turned cheese rinds into broth, crusts into thickening agents. Nothing was wasted. Everything had a second life. And in the background, always, the church calendar. Fasting days forced creativity. No meat, no dairy, just vegetables and grains. Some found ways around it. Almond milk, surprisingly common, replaced dairy. Fish, permitted on fasting days, became a rare treat even for those inland, preserved in salt or caught from streams. These foods built the bodies that built the cathedrals, the roads, the fields. They nourished the minds that kept folklore alive. They sustained families through plagues, wars, and winters. So tonight, as you reflect on your own kitchen, your own meals, consider the quiet power of turnips, the legacy of barley, the humble wisdom of leeks. They don't shimmer like spices. They don't inspire poetry, but they fed a world. In our next chapter, we'll step into the rare world of meat, how it was raised, rationed, hunted, and hoarded. But for now, let's rest in the garden among the rows of peas and beans and give thanks to the patient, persistent hands that coaxed life from soil. This is the root of nourishment. This is the quiet history of food. Welcome now to the rarefied world of medieval meat. Not the everyday fare for most, but something special, rare, almost sacred in its presence on the table of the common folk. In the medieval world, meat wasn't just food. It was a symbol, a token of status, a gamble, a luxury often beyond the reach of most. Let's start with a pig. Imagine a small, bristled animal rooting through scraps behind a cottage. This pig isn't a pet. It's an investment. It will be raised sometimes, communally, for months or even a full year. It eats waste, kitchen scraps, whatever it can forage. It's not just meat on legs. It's winter food, future fat for cooking, bristles for brushes, bones for tools. When it is finally slaughtered, usually in late autumn, it becomes an event. Families gather. Every part of the animal is used. Nothing is wasted. The meat is salted, smoked, or boiled for preservation. Sausages are made from the blood and offal, mixed with herbs, if any are to be spared. The head might become brawn or head cheese, a jelly-like dish that, while unappetizing to modern tastes, was a prized, efficient way to make every morsel count. For most of the year, however, meat was absent. Chickens were too valuable for their eggs. Cows were precious for their milk and labor. Even the occasional lamb was seen more for its wool than its meat. A stew might include a knuckle or bone for flavor, but the bulk would be beans, turnips, and cabbage. When meat did appear, it was cause for celebration or concern. A sudden gift of meat might signal illness in a neighbor's flock, or a family might slaughter an old animal they couldn't afford to keep through winter. In either case, the meat was shared. Generosity was survival. Neighbors relied on one another. Hunting, for the peasant class, was more fantasy than freedom. Forests were tightly controlled, the domain of lords and kings. Poaching, killing a deer or boar without permission, was a serious crime, punishable by mutilation or death. And yet, hunger has always been a persuasive argument. Men crept into the woods, set traps, and prayed not to be caught. Wild rabbits, birds, and the occasional fish from a nearby stream might supplement a meal. Fishing was slightly more accessible. In coastal or riverside communities, fish became the poor man's meat. Herrings were salted, eels caught and stewed, trout smoked or dried. The church's many fasting days, often more than half the year, created a demand for fish. It was technically permitted, though still expensive, in many regions. Salted cod from Norway, dried and shipped across Europe, was one of the few luxuries that reached even modest tables during Lent. Preservation was essential. Meat spoiled fast. Without refrigeration, it had to be eaten quickly, salted heavily, or smoked for days. These processes were time-consuming and costly. Salt, especially, was a commodity. In some towns, it was guarded like treasure. Monasteries were the one exception where meat was more regularly consumed. Though monks followed religious rules that limited their diet, many orders had loopholes. Fish was not considered meat. Birds like geese or swans, argued some, were akin to fish because they swam. Over time, monasteries developed elaborate dining practices that allowed for more luxurious meals under the guise of piety. For the nobility, meat was constant and extravagant. Roasted venison, whole boars, and platters of fowl were served with pomp. The kitchens of castles turned meat into theater. Peacocks were cooked and redressed in their feathers. Swans were basted in saffron and wine. It wasn't just about eating, it was about spectacle. But even here, the risk of foodborne illness loomed. Without modern knowledge of bacteria, meat often sat for hours or days. Illness was common. Opulence did not guarantee safety, and yet the allure of meat remained strong. It was embedded in language, in religion, in the very idea of feast. Meat meant celebration, it meant power, it meant life. For the common folk, meat existed mostly in memory and dream, perhaps once a year at a festival, perhaps shared when a pig was butchered, perhaps in the thin broth left from a boiled bone. Enough to remember the taste, but not enough to depend on it. Still, creativity endured. Recipes emerged to simulate meat's heartiness, mashed beans with garlic and oil, barley thickened into paste, cabbage roasted to bring out a sweet, earthy flavor. These dishes weren't meat, but they comforted the same. They warmed the same. They filled the same hollow. And sometimes, despite the odds, there were moments of true indulgence. A traveling merchant might sell smoked sausage. A lord might gift a ham during winter. A wedding might include roast goose. These memories stayed bright in the mind, repeated in stories, remembered through hunger. As we close this chapter, reflect on the meaning of meat, not just as food, but as symbol, sacrifice, and memory. In our next section, we'll explore how medieval people preserved what little they had. We'll venture into the smoky world of drying racks, the sour tang of fermentation, and the creative extremes people embraced to survive the lean months. But for now, imagine a table with a single, shared roast. Imagine the care with which it's sliced, the reverence with which it's eaten. That is the world we've stepped into. Sleep well and dream of warm stews, of hearths aglow, and the rare blessing of a hearty meal. As we step deeper into the medieval kitchen, we leave behind the fleeting luxury of meat and enter a space defined by creativity, caution, and necessity. Food preservation. This was not just about saving leftovers. It was about surviving winter, enduring famine, and stretching each morsel until it gave up its last possible benefit. This is where salt, smoke, sourness, and strategy became the true cooks. Let us begin with salt. Salt was as precious as it was essential. It preserved meat and fish, made pickling possible, and allowed grains and vegetables to last longer. In medieval Europe, entire towns were built around salt production, like Lüneburg in Germany and the great salt pans of Venice. Salt wasn't merely seasoning, it was currency, symbol, and savior. To preserve meat with salt, it would be rubbed with coarse crystals, then left to cure in cool, dark places. Layers of fat helped protect it. Sometimes meat was stored in barrels filled with brine, a saltwater solution so dense that it turned the flesh leathery and intensely salty. These barrels traveled far, from coastal fisheries to inland markets, feeding towns far from the sea. Fish, especially cod and herring, were preserved this way. Cod was dried into something almost inedible, unless boiled for hours. Herring, salted in great numbers, became a staple of both the poor and the pious. Its strong, pungent smell was familiar in cities and villages alike. Next came smoke. Smoking was often a communal effort. A smokehouse, usually a small, dark shed, was filled with hooks and racks. Meat, fish, even sausages were hung over smoldering fires. The smoke curled up, slow and steady, drying the meat while infusing it with flavor. Wood type mattered. Oak, beech, and alder added different notes. In winter, the smokehouse was a lifeline, but the ingenuity didn't stop there. Fermentation was the medieval magician. It transformed cabbage into sauerkraut, milk into cheese, grains into beer, and fruit into vinegar. These changes not only preserved the food, but often made it more nutritious. Fermented cabbage kept scurvy at bay. Ale, weak but safe, replaced water in many homes. Cheese was a way to store milk, rich in fat and protein, for months. Pickling was another tool in the preservation kit. Vegetables were placed in ceramic or wooden barrels, submerged in brine or vinegar, and weighted with stones to keep them submerged. This method was particularly valuable during fasting periods when meat and dairy were forbidden. Drying was simple, effective, and vital. Fruits, mushrooms, and herbs were laid out in the sun or hung in bundles in the rafters of kitchens. Dried apples, pears, and plums rehydrated in stews. Mushrooms added depth to meatless soups. Herbs like thyme, mint, and dill were crushed into pots and bottles, storing the scent of summer through the bleak months. Bread, too, had to be preserved. Stale bread was not discarded. It was repurposed, soaked in broth, layered in stews, or fried in animal fat. It added texture and bulk. In wealthier homes, it became the base of dishes like bread pudding or was sweetened with honey. Milk, difficult to preserve in its natural state, was turned into cheese or buttermilk. Some areas used animal stomachs to help curdle milk, forming early rennet cheeses. These cheeses varied in hardness and flavor. Some were eaten fresh, others aged into hard, tangy wheels, stored in cloth or wax. And then there were the strange and desperate methods. Some bakers added fillers to bread, acorns, sawdust, even chalk, to stretch flour supplies. These practices were dangerous, but common during famines. In harder times, people boiled roots with ash, drank broth made from boiled bones, or even chewed bark to calm hunger. These preservation methods shaped not only what people ate, but how they lived. A good smokehouse meant a better winter. A well-stocked root cellar offered peace of mind. Families planned their seasons around preservation days. When the pig was slaughtered, the cider bottled, the herbs hung to dry. Children helped prepare. They gathered apples, shelled beans, tied herbs into bunches. Elders passed down the rhythms, how long to soak beans, when the cabbage was ready for fermentation, how to judge a cheese by smell alone. It was not glamorous, but it was sacred in its own way. These were acts of care, of foresight, of community, resilience. A shared salt barrel or a borrowed smokehouse could mean life or death in a hard winter. Even the smallest preserved good, a jar of sauerkraut, a smoked sausage, was a triumph of planning over chaos. Even feasts relied on preserved goods. A noble banquet might serve dried fruits from a distant land, salted fish during Lent, or smoked ham during winter festivals. Preservation bridged the seasons and connected tables across class lines. And in monasteries, preservation took on a ritualistic tone. Monks kept cellars with orderly rows of dried herbs, smoked meats, and pickled vegetables. Their records became some of the earliest cookbooks, measured not in taste, but in preservation value. So tonight, as your world slows, imagine a wooden shelf lined with clay pots, a hanging string of garlic, a smoked ham wrapped in linen, a basket of dried apples, waiting patiently for stew. These were treasures not kept for show, but for survival. Preservation was not just practical, it was philosophical. It taught patience, prudence, and respect for food. In a world where spoilage was the enemy, every ounce saved was a small miracle. In our next chapter, we'll open the pantry doors of the medieval city and peek into its darker side, the hazards of hygiene and the ever-present threat of illness. But for now, let's linger in the cellar, breathe in the spice of vinegar, and admire the cleverness of those who made every season yield more than its share. Let us now move beyond the cellar and into the unsettling shadows of the medieval street. While the ingenuity of preservation kept food from spoiling, another battle raged silently and persistently, the battle against filth, decay, and disease. This is the darker side of medieval food, a story of contamination, ignorance, and invisible threats. Picture a narrow alley in a medieval town, cobblestones slick with rain and refuse. Open drains carry a slow, grim stream of waste, human, animal, and culinary. Rats scurry openly. Dogs sniff at rotting scraps. The scent is overwhelming. Rank, sour, earthy. This is the backdrop of food production and preparation for most people living in medieval cities. There were no garbage trucks, no modern plumbing. Waste was tossed into the street from windows. Chamber pots emptied with a shout, "Gardy-loo," or warning to anyone passing below. But the shout couldn't stop the flies. It couldn't stop the diseases carried in the water. Water was the most dangerous necessity. Wells were easily contaminated. Rivers ran brown with waste. In such conditions, Even washing vegetables could do more harm than good. Boiling water, though helpful, was not always practiced. Instead, people turned to ale, weak, often brewed in homes, consumed even by children. It was safer than water, barely alcoholic, but boiled in the brewing process. Ale offered hydration without the same risk of infection. Public fountains and communal wells became lifelines for communities, yet they were often located too close to cesspits and tannery runoff. The mingling of waste with water sources meant that even the appearance of cleanliness was deceptive. It wasn't unusual for a well to be the source of a deadly outbreak, infecting entire families before anyone realized the danger. Food sold in the markets was exposed to all of this. Butchers carved meat on open tables, swatting flies. Fishmongers stacked eels in buckets, barely covered. Bread sat uncovered on wooden planks. Rats and mice were everywhere. Cats helped, but not enough. Disease spread fast, and no one knew why. The concept of germs was centuries away. People blamed bad air, moral failings, or divine punishment. Hygiene was understood through a lens of religious and symbolic purity. Cleanliness of spirit mattered more than the body. Bathing was rare and often associated with sin or vanity. In kitchens, meat and vegetables were stored close to animals. Chickens roamed indoors. Cows were milked in the same yard where children played. Without refrigeration, meat spoiled quickly. Milk turned sour. Eggs sat unrefrigerated for days. And yet, life went on. Food poisoning was common. Though the term didn't exist, people fell ill and died suddenly. Some recovered. Others succumbed to what were vaguely termed fluxes, fevers, or ague. Kings and paupers alike were vulnerable. King John of England may have died from a meal of peaches gone bad. In the royal court, extravagant meals were often accompanied by stomach ailments. Even religious institutions, which held the most detailed records, couldn't stem the tide. Monasteries wrote of outbreaks, but without understanding. Their clean cellars and ordered larders were no match for the hidden world of microbes. One major outbreak defined this period, the Black Death. Though not caused by food, its spread was accelerated by poor hygiene and close quarters. Fleas on rats carried the plague, and rats thrived where waste and food mingled. The markets, the kitchens, the homes, they were perfect breeding grounds. Despite this grim backdrop, there were efforts at control. Some towns established regulations. Markets were required to clean their stalls. Butchers were moved outside the city walls. Fines were issued for dumping waste, but enforcement was inconsistent. Privilege often shielded the wealthy. The poor endured. In the countryside, things were marginally better. Air was cleaner, waste less concentrated. But even here, water was suspect. Wells were shallow. Animals shared the same water sources. Food safety was a gamble everywhere. Village customs varied, and some communities practiced ritualized cleaning of wells and fountains, driven more by tradition than science, but with occasional positive effects. Amid all this, people found their own methods of caution. Smelling food became a survival skill. If it reeked, it was tossed, or heavily spiced to mask the flavor. Vinegar was used to rinse vegetables. Salted or pickled items were seen as safer. Cooking thoroughly was not just tradition, it was protection. And in the superstitions and customs of the time, we glimpse a kind of folk hygiene, burning herbs to cleanse the air, avoiding certain foods in specific seasons, fasting and feasting aligned with observations of bodily health. Even if not scientifically accurate, apothecaries sold mixtures said to purify the body and balance humors. Garlic, onions, and vinegar were believed to protect against disease. Even aromatic sachets filled with lavender, rosemary, or cloves were carried around necks or hung in homes to ward off sickness. The belief in these rituals underscored a desperate hope for control in a world that offered little. Still, the risk never vanished. Every meal was a small act of courage, and that courage rested not only in the food itself, but in the people who prepared it, from peasant mothers stirring pots to monks measuring grains, from bakers kneading dough in open-air ovens to fishmongers hauling salted catches. Each was an agent in a delicate and often dangerous chain of nourishment. We continue then, from kitchen to market, into the bustling, perilous center of the medieval food system. Here, color and chaos met survival. The medieval marketplace was more than a place to buy and sell. It was a place where food, fate, and fear collided daily. We move now into the heart of the medieval town, the marketplace. It was not just a place of exchange, but of spectacle, sound, and smell. Crowded, loud, alive. Here, food was sold and stories were shared. And yet, beneath the vibrant surface, danger lurked. Markets were as much battlegrounds for health as they were centers of commerce. Imagine the scene: narrow streets funneling into a central square, lined with wooden stalls, tents, and carts. The air is thick with competing aromas: spices, roasted meats, sweat, manure, and open fish barrels. Vendors shout to attract attention, holding up apples, sausages, and loaves of bread. Children weave through crowds. Chickens flap in cages. Dogs bark, hoping for scraps. For many, the market was a lifeline. Few peasants could grow everything they needed. A bit of coin or trade might buy salt, oil, onions, or grain. Some came to sell what little surplus they had: a wheel of cheese, a bunch of leeks, a few eggs. For the merchant, each day brought risk. Would they sell enough? Would thieves strike? Would the goods spoil before noon? Food in the market was exposed. Bread lay open to the elements. Butchers displayed cuts of meat in the open air. Fish were laid on boards or in baskets, sometimes with damp cloths, but never truly chilled. The concept of refrigeration was limited to natural cellars or, in colder climates, winter snow. In summer, the problem was acute. Spoiled meat was common, and markets often reeked of rot by afternoon. Despite these conditions, buyers had to trust their instincts. Smelling and touching were normal parts of shopping. A customer might prod a fish to check firmness, sniff a slab of pork for sourness, or press a wheel of cheese. Sellers swore their goods were fresh. Some lied. Others did their best. To maintain order, some towns established food inspection systems. Officials called market overseers or weighmen were tasked with checking for fraud and enforcing price controls. In theory, these figures ensured fair trade and public safety. In practice, they were inconsistent, often corrupt, and sometimes overwhelmed. The diversity of food was both exciting and deceptive. Imported goods dazzled the wealthy. Dried figs, almonds, saffron, dates. For the poor, the fare was simpler: onions, rye bread, dried fish. Yet all buyers shared a common risk: the invisible threat of contamination. A tainted piece of meat or spoiled batch of grain could sicken an entire household. The grain market held special importance. Flour was the foundation of most diets, but it was also one of the most adulterated goods. Bakers were sometimes caught mixing sawdust, chalk, or old flour into their dough. Penalties ranged from fines to public humiliation. One common punishment was the pillory, where fraudulent sellers were locked into wooden stocks and mocked by the public. Milk and dairy were particularly vulnerable. Without refrigeration, milk spoiled quickly. Curdled or sour milk might be turned into cheese or butter, but sometimes it was simply sold as is. Buyers developed keen senses to detect spoilage. Cheese was safer, but only slightly. Some molds were harmless, others deadly. Even fruits and vegetables carried risk. They were often rinsed in contaminated water or sold with soil still clinging to their roots. Street dust and animal droppings found their way onto food easily. Yet, demand was high, and sellers rarely discarded imperfect produce. Food fraud extended beyond simple spoilage. Some vendors dyed meat with animal blood to mask grayness. Others used wine or vinegar to mask foul odors. Ale was watered down or mixed with herbs to disguise off flavors. These tricks were widespread, and consumers grew wary. Markets were also spaces of exchange between rural and urban life. Farmers brought produce, hunters sold game, and fishermen displayed their catches. Urban dwellers depended on this influx, and relationships formed over time. A trustworthy vendor might earn lifelong customers. A single scandal, however, could ruin a reputation. During religious festivals and holy days, markets swelled. More people meant more food, but also more waste, more risk, more chaos. Vendors fought for space, shouting louder, pushing harder. Pickpockets mingled with crowds. Disease spread in the press of bodies and the mingling of goods. Sanitation efforts, when they existed, were minimal. Some towns required markets to be swept weekly. Others banned offal and fish waste from being dumped in public wells. But with limited enforcement, many vendors cleaned only what was necessary, and rats continued to thrive. Even noble courts, which received the best goods, were not immune. Their servants purchased food from the same markets, albeit more selectively. Contamination at the source affected all levels of society. Wealth could purchase more food, but not necessarily safer food. Some vendors adapted. They sold food early, before the sun made meat sweat and fish bloat. They used cloths soaked in vinegar to swat flies. They arranged stalls under trees or in shaded courtyards. But these were band-aids, not solutions. And yet, despite all this, the marketplace was a marvel of survival. It was the pulse of the medieval town, where the daily drama of food, scarcity, danger, sustenance, and trust played out in full view. It was noisy and chaotic, but also resilient. These markets endured for centuries, laying the groundwork for today's supermarkets and farmers markets. The problems changed, but the essence remained. People gathered to exchange nourishment for coin, to weigh risks against needs, and to seek a little certainty in an uncertain world. Next, we'll leave the city square and enter the quieter, structured world of monasteries, where food took on spiritual significance and the rules of the table followed a higher calling. Leaving behind the bustling, chaotic marketplace, we enter a very different world, the cloistered silence of the medieval monastery. Here, the rules were different. Time moved with the rhythm of bells. Meals followed not hunger, but devotion. Food was not only sustenance, it was a spiritual matter, a discipline, a reflection of the divine. Monasteries were among the most organized and hygienic places in medieval Europe. While the secular world wrestled with filth and famine, many monastic communities created structured, stable environments. Cleanliness, moderation, and self-sufficiency were core values. Within their walls, food was grown, prepared, and consumed with quiet reverence. The daily life of a monk was divided by the hours of prayer, and these hours shaped when and what they ate. Most followed the rule of Saint Benedict, which emphasized austerity, 2 meals a day, no meat from 4-legged animals, fasting on holy days, silence during meals. But as with many rules, interpretation varied widely. Imagine a Benedictine kitchen in the 12th century. It's spacious, orderly, and bustling with quiet activity. Brothers chop leeks and carrots. A large pot simmers over a hearth. Nearby, bread rises under linen cloths. There's no shouting, no chaos, just the rhythm of work done with purpose. The monastery grew much of its own food, vegetables from gardens, fish from ponds, grain from nearby fields, herbs for flavor and medicine, apples, pears, and berries from orchards, honey from hives. They milled their own flour, brewed their own ale, and sometimes even pressed oil or made wine. Meat was restricted, but fish, eggs, and dairy were permitted, especially on non-fasting days. Over time, some monasteries developed complex culinary loopholes. Beavers, for instance, were considered fish because they lived in water. Thus, they could be eaten during Lent. In wealthier abbeys, the diet became surprisingly rich, though still within the technical boundaries of religious law. Meals were typically taken in a refectory, a long, echoing hall with simple wooden tables. Monks ate in silence, listening as one of their brothers read aloud from scripture or saints' lives. The food was plain, but nourishing: vegetable stew, coarse bread, a bit of cheese or fruit, and a mug of small beer. During Lent and Advent, the menu grew even simpler: no dairy, no eggs, no fat. Meals might consist only of legumes, bread, and watery soup. These fasts were seen as acts of purification, aligning body and soul with the divine through denial. But monasteries also fed others. Pilgrims, the sick, and the poor came to their doors. Hospitality was a sacred duty. Special guest houses provided basic meals and rest. The almoner, a monk responsible for charity, distributed bread, ale, and sometimes leftovers to the needy. This generosity helped cement monasteries as centers of stability. In times of famine, people turned to them for food. In times of war, for shelter. Their granaries were among the most reliable, their kitchens some of the most consistent, and their records among the best preserved. From these records, we learn not just what they ate, but how they thought about food. For monks, eating was never just eating. It was a spiritual act. Gluttony was a sin, and moderation a virtue. Meals were measured, not only in quantity, but in intention. Excess was discouraged. Even joy in food was approached with caution. The goal was nourishment, not pleasure. That said, not all monks lived as austerely as the rules demanded. In wealthier orders, the food could become quite indulgent, still meatless, but rich in fish, eggs, pastries, and even sweetened dishes. Some abbots were criticized for living too well, and reform movements periodically tried to restore stricter practices. The monastic garden was a marvel of planning. Rows of kale, onions, leeks, herbs, and legumes, raised beds, compost heaps, stone paths. The apothecary garden grew medicinal plants, sage, mint, valerian, chamomile. Everything had a purpose, both physical and spiritual, and behind it all was a worldview that saw food as both gift and test. To waste was sinful, to overindulge, dangerous, to share, holy. Every bowl of soup was a reminder of Christ's humility, every loaf of bread, a symbol of divine provision. Even a simple apple could carry echoes of Scripture. In the medieval imagination, monasteries were not only places of prayer, they were islands of order, and food, perhaps more than anything, illustrated this order. While the city markets teemed with noise, risk, and commerce, the monastic kitchen hummed with quiet efficiency. As we step back from the cloister's calm, we see how these communities shaped not only the spiritual, but the agricultural and culinary landscape of Europe. They preserved seeds, techniques, and recipes. They created systems that would influence farming and cooking for centuries. Now, we move forward again, from the silence of the monastery to the noise of the feast hall. In our next section, we'll explore the grand tables of medieval nobility, where food became power, theater, and spectacle. From the quiet, contemplative meals of the monastery, we now enter the great halls of castles and manors, where dining was anything but modest. In the world of medieval nobility, food was not just sustenance. It was a language of power, wealth, and spectacle. A noble's table was a stage, and every dish a statement. Picture a grand feast hall, high vaulted ceilings, torches flickering along stone walls, long wooden tables lined with ornate cups, platters, and trenchers. Tapestries hang, musicians play, and the scent of roasting meats, warm bread, and spiced wine fills the air. This is not a daily occurrence, but when it happens, on feast days, weddings, and political gatherings, it is elaborate, theatrical, and expensive. For the medieval elite, Meals were opportunities to demonstrate status. A large spread meant not just abundance, but influence. Lords and ladies ate foods that peasants could only dream of. Exotic spices, multiple types of meat, imported fruits, rich pastries. Presentation was essential. Swans might be roasted and served redressed in their feathers. Peacocks, too, were roasted and presented in full plumage, glittering with gold leaf. The structure of noble meals followed strict codes. Meals were divided into courses, with each course featuring several dishes. It was common for guests to be offered 10 or more dishes per course. These included roast meats, stews, pies, jellies, fish, and sweet dishes, often served all at once in great variety. Guests selected from what they preferred. The trenchers, thick slices of stale bread used as plates, absorbed juices and sauces at the end of the meal. They were often given to the poor or servants, soaked with the essence of the feast. Silverware was rare. Diners used knives and fingers. Spoons were for soups and stews. Napkins were long pieces of cloth draped over shoulders or tucked at the collar. Despite the extravagance, etiquette ruled the table. Guests were expected to behave with decorum. No elbows on the table, no reaching across dishes, and certainly no excessive eating or drinking. Manners reflected nobility as much as clothing or speech. Spices featured heavily in noble cuisine: cinnamon, cloves, nutmeg, saffron, and pepper were not merely for flavor. They were marks of luxury. A dish with several spices signaled wealth. Even the color of food mattered. Golden hues, achieved with saffron or egg yolks, were seen as regal. Meat was king at these tables. Venison, boar, rabbit, and poultry filled the menu. Fish, especially on fasting days, included salmon, pike, eel, and sturgeon. Freshwater fish were prized. Even animals like hedgehogs or beavers might appear, often shaped into whimsical dishes. Some meals featured subtleties, elaborate, often symbolic dishes meant to amuse or awe, like pies that released live birds when cut open, or molded jellies shaped like castles or saints. Wine flowed freely, though often mixed with water or spices. Mead and ale were also common. Drinking was ritualized. Toasts were given. Cups passed hand to hand. The cupbearer ensured that drinks were not poisoned, a real concern in courts of intrigue. Music and performance accompanied the meal. Minstrels sang, jesters entertained, and storytellers recited legends. A noble feast was as much a cultural event as it was a meal. Great efforts were made to impress guests, especially visiting dignitaries, whose opinions carried weight beyond the table. Yet behind the glamour lay a small army of workers: cooks, bakers, brewers, butchers, spit boys, servers, and dishwashers, all coordinated to prepare and deliver the spectacle. The kitchen was its own world, often separate from the hall, bustling and dangerous. Fires roared, knives flashed, cauldrons steamed. Timing was crucial, presentation vital. Waste was significant. Leftovers were sometimes distributed to the poor, but much was discarded. This was part of the statement. To waste was to display excess. However, not all nobles indulged equally. Some took pride in moderation and order, aligning themselves with emerging Christian ideals of humility and stewardship. Documents from noble households give us insight into their provisions. Inventories list barrels of wine, dozens of cheeses, sacks of flour, pounds of spice. Account books record payments to fishmongers, cheesemakers, hunters, and spice merchants. Menus from royal banquets list courses with over 50 separate dishes. These meals also reinforced hierarchies. Seating was assigned by rank. The lord and his family sat at the high table, often on a raised platform. Important guests sat nearby. Lesser guests sat lower, with simpler food and fewer courses. Even the type of bread varied by status: white for the noble, brown for the guest, coarse for the servant. Feasts were political tools. A generous host earned loyalty and admiration. A lavish table could seal alliances, mark transitions of power, or celebrate military victory. The language of the meal communicated strength, wealth, and hospitality. Despite all this richness, noble meals were not without danger. Underlying all the pomp was the risk of illness: spoiled meat, contaminated water, or even deliberate poisoning. Physicians were sometimes present to monitor the health of important guests, and food tasters employed to detect foul play. The medieval noble feast was thus both an indulgence and a performance. It fed bodies, certainly, but also egos, ambitions, and reputations. To dine in a castle was to witness the theater of power. Next, we descend from these lofty tables to explore a more humble, yet equally telling realm: the role of bread. How one simple food came to define class, survival, and even the sacred in the medieval world. From the echoing feast halls of nobility, where peacocks shimmered and gold leaf crowned meat, we now turn to something far simpler, but no less profound: bread. In the medieval world, bread was more than food. It was survival, status, and often salvation. The type of bread you ate said everything about who you were. Bread was the backbone of the medieval diet, eaten daily by rich and poor alike. But the similarities ended there. For the elite, bread was soft, white, and fine, made from sifted wheat flour, carefully kneaded and baked to perfection. For the poor, bread was coarse, dark, and dense, mixed with rye, barley, oats, and often with fillers like bran, peas, or even acorns in desperate times. To understand medieval bread is to understand medieval life itself. Let's begin with the types. At the top was manchet, a fine white bread eaten by the nobility. Then came ravel, or yeoman's bread, often made with a mix of wheat and rye, consumed by merchants and wealthier townsfolk. At the bottom was maslin and horse bread, dark, heavy loaves with inconsistent textures, common among peasants and laborers. Horse bread, as the name suggests, was sometimes fed to animals, but also eaten by humans in times of need. Bread was so essential that it appeared in laws, sermons, and even superstitions. Bakers were strictly regulated. In England, the assize of bread and ale, first enacted in the 13th century, set prices and standards to prevent fraud and ensure access to affordable bread. A baker who cheated customers could be pilloried, or worse. The fear of being labeled dishonest led some bakers to add an extra loaf to every dozen, a practice that gave us the term baker's dozen. But the bread itself was not always safe. Poor quality flour, mold, and adulterants like chalk or dust were known problems. During famines, desperate bakers might mix in tree bark, old breadcrumbs, or anything remotely edible. The results could be deadly, yet hunger outweighed caution. The bread oven was a vital feature in any village. Communal ovens were common in smaller settlements where families brought their prepared dough to be baked. In cities, bakeries became essential services. The oven was the heart of domestic life. Hot, dangerous, sacred. Religiously, bread held deep significance. In the Christian tradition, it symbolized the body of Christ. The Eucharist, sacred communion, used special, unleavened bread made with great care. Monasteries often baked their own communion wafers. Bread fed both body and soul. In art and literature, bread appeared constantly. It was the first item listed in hospitality. It was the thing shared in parables. It stood for peace, famine, and everything in between. A person without bread was truly poor. And then there was trench bread, stale loaves used as plates during feasts. These trenchers soaked up juices, sauces, and fats, becoming edible repositories of flavor. Afterward, they were given to the poor or discarded depending on wealth and conscience. The act of baking itself was layered with tradition. Superstitions governed how and when bread could be made. Some said, never bake on Good Friday. Others placed crosses on loaves to ward off evil. A burned loaf might be seen as a bad omen. Bread was watched, blessed, and respected. For women especially, bread making was a daily ritual. It was physical labor, mixing, kneading, rising, baking, but also emotional. It fed children, supported marriages, and formed community. A good loaf meant praise. A poor one meant whispers. In times of war or plague, bread distribution could mark who lived and who starved. Siege towns rationed flour by the ounce. Monasteries became bread lines. Lords who gave out bread earned loyalty or secured peace. Even today, echoes remain. We talk of earning our bread, breaking bread, being the breadwinner. Bread lingers in our language because it lingered in their lives. In the medieval mind, bread was not just eaten, it was felt, needed, prayed for. It filled bellies and defined status. It taught patience and endurance. It reflected the bounty of nature and the limits of human labor. As we prepare to conclude this journey, bread serves as a perfect symbol. It connected fields to ovens, peasants to kings, earth to altar. It was, in every sense, the staff of life. In our final section, we'll look back at what we've uncovered. The spices that crossed oceans, the pigs raised with care, the fish salted for Lent, the meat that marked feasts, and the bread that sustained it all. A simple, essential thread through the complex fabric of medieval history. As we conclude our journey through the world of medieval food, we find ourselves looking back over a vast and textured landscape, from spice routes that crisscrossed continents to the humble hearths of peasant cottages. Every bite of food in the Middle Ages carried with it a story of labor, belief, scarcity, and survival. Let us now gather the threads of what we've explored. We began with spices, those fragrant, coveted treasures from the east that traveled overland and by sea, touching ports and palaces alike. These tiny, aromatic bits of bark, root, and seed transformed cuisine and commerce. They flavored food, preserved it, and more importantly, signified wealth and connection to global trade networks. From there, we turned our gaze to the backbone of daily sustenance: crops and produce, barley, beans, leeks, and turnips, modest, enduring, and essential. The peasant diet, built on porridge and root vegetables, was not glamorous, but it was resilient. These foods, grown through hardship and harvested with care, kept villages alive year after year. Meat, in contrast, was the exception, a rare indulgence for most. It held power and symbolism beyond nutrition. A slaughtered pig meant weeks of food shared with neighbors. A poached deer was a dangerous gift, and in noble courts, meat was performance. Roasted swans and game pies, not just eaten, but admired. Preservation was the hidden magic that made all these foods last. Salt, smoke, drying, fermentation. These were the technologies of survival. Cellars and smokehouses, vinegar jars and brine barrels were lifelines through long winters and unpredictable harvests. Yet none of this happened in clean, sterile environments. In cities, food hygiene was precarious. Open drains, flies, and contamination made every meal a gamble. Ale replaced water, not for flavor, but for safety. Disease traveled with goods. Fear and food walked hand in hand. The market was the pulse of the town, colorful, crowded, chaotic. It brought together peasants and merchants, buyers and beggars. Regulations tried to impose order, but fraud and rot were constant risks. Trust was earned stall by stall, bite by bite. In contrast, monasteries offered order. Their meals were quiet, structured, spiritually motivated. Food was discipline. Gardens were medicine. Fasting was faith. Yet even within austerity, monastic kitchens produced food that fed the soul as well as the body. At the other extreme, noble feasts dazzled with wealth and excess. These were tables where alliances were forged and reputations cemented. Every spice used, every bird served whole, every gold-tipped goblet was a declaration of power. And then, bread, the common thread, eaten by all, but never the same. For the rich, it was soft and white. For the poor, dark and dense. Bread told you who someone was. It reflected their place in society. It fed their children. It filled the silence of prayer. It was, in every way, essential. What ties all of this together is the profound connection between food and humanity. Medieval food was not just about hunger, it was about meaning. It carried religion, politics, love, fear, and identity. To eat was to engage with the world, its dangers, its gifts, its hopes. Today, much of this has changed. Our food is packaged, transported, and labeled. We are shielded from spoilage, disease, and hunger in ways our ancestors could never imagine. Yet the echoes remain. We still gather at tables, we still break bread, we still flavor our dishes with spices once worth their weight in gold. This history is not just about the past, it shapes the way we see food now. It reminds us to respect the labor that feeds us, the rituals that surround our meals, and the deep roots of every simple dish, from cellar to castle, from monastery to market, from seed to loaf. We've walked through a world where food was everything, and in remembering it, we bring a little more reverence to the meals we eat today. Thank you for walking this journey. May it deepen not only your knowledge, but your next bite.